This week, we're going to be talking about energy balance and appetite regulation. Some of this should be review from your prerequisite coursework, but this is a really key concept in the topic of weight management. And so I want to make sure to highlight some certain aspects and make sure to kind of draw your attention to some particular things and review a few items that you've probably had before. This is also These are also concepts that as you move forward into some of the key assignments in this class, that you will really want to take this topic into consideration and some of the things covered this week into consideration. So we'll go ahead and move through some of this information on energy balance and appetite regulation. So first of all, energy balance really is that concept of do calories in equal calories out? So are the calories that we're consuming approximately equal to the calories that we're using in a given day? And again, this isn't really difficult concept, but it's something that I think we can't forget with all of the hype related to weight loss and diet plans and all of those kinds of things, and even emerging science in the areas of weight management. I think sometimes it's easy to feel like there is still something magical out there in terms of how we can lose weight. And really, this is the core to weight management. And we'll talk about how it applies and how to kind of use it in our favor or make it work for people as much as possible. But really, that concept of is our caloric intake balancing with our caloric usage during the day? And we'll talk a little bit in this lesson and lecture, what all goes into the calories we use, but that's still a very key concept. So as we move forward, we want to think about some of the factors that do perhaps contribute to obesity. And I say contribute, not cause, because there isn't necessarily most often one specific cause for an individual to become obese. There's generally a variety of factors that all play a piece in the picture. So when we look at our rates of obesity in our country, and as we talked about last week, they've kind of stabilized off a little bit, still are very high, but have stabilized off. But as those were rapidly rising, the question was very much, what's causing this? What's the root issue? So again, we just talked about that calories in, calories out is sort of a key aspect of weight control. So the first thing we think about is, is it the caloric intake that is causing the high rates of obesity? And there is a lot related to caloric intake in our, in the United States as well as other developed countries. So we look at things like the availability of high calorie foods. When we look around, things like, and these are topics that are covered in your book and you've probably heard about, but just to kind of bring them to the forefront of your mind, things like large portion sizes, particularly when we eat out, the amount that we meaning in general in our society eat out versus at home, the availability of very high calorie foods, and sometimes those high calorie foods are low cost foods. So I have in here even food insecurity and socioeconomic status, because actually people who are in a lower socioeconomic status have a higher risk of becoming overweight or obese, which would seem kind of contradictory with the food insecurity, but sometimes those inexpensive foods are those that are very calorically dense. So there's certainly some factors related to caloric intake that our calories seem to be going up. It's easier to eat more calories, more snack foods. There's certainly more availability of foods, even starting with children, that a lot more access to foods throughout the day, and high calorie foods. Another big issue related to caloric intake to always consider is beverages. So sugar sweetened beverages, whether that be soda, fruit drinks, energy drinks, all of those types of things. The calories that we get from liquids really are easy to overconsume. We'll talk a little bit today about factors that affect hunger and satiety, but we really don't get that full feeling from calories that come from liquids like juice drinks, sodas, energy drinks, all of those sorts of things. And so that can contribute. So caloric intake certainly is a factor. Physical inactivity is also something that's looked at, again, kind of thinking about things that affect many people. So many jobs now are much more technology driven, much more sedentary than jobs used to be. So that certainly has an impact. We also, on average, work more hours in the day, which leaves less free time for leisurely physical activity. So there's definitely issues related to physical inactivity. We also have much more leisure activities that are sedentary type of activities, whether that be watching TV, playing video games, being on the computer, all of those kinds of things that lead us to be less active than we used to be in general. I already talked briefly about food insecurity and socioeconomic status. Genetics is a factor that's an interesting factor because it certainly plays a role. So we certainly know that, for example, someone who has overweight or obese parents is more likely to be overweight or obese, but it definitely isn't the whole picture. So when we look at the where obesity rates were rapidly rising, we know that our genetic profile did not change that quickly. So genes, in a population, the genetic sort of the overall genetic makeup of a population changes extremely slowly over time, where the rates of obesity were rapidly rising. So genetics definitely play a role, but it's not necessarily an absolute cause, more that it sets some people up to be more susceptible to some of the other contributing factors, such as high caloric intake, those types of things. Some people are more sensitive to physical inactivity, meaning that they are more likely to gain weight when they're physically inactive than other people, and those types of things. So the genetics sort of set someone up to be at higher risk for some of the other factors that contribute to obesity. So many other things. Your book talks about some. There's a variety of other places you can get information on some of the factors contributing to obesity, but it's not just one thing, and I think that's important to remember because there's a lot of aspects to obesity, which means when we talk about looking at treatment or interventions or helping someone to lose weight, we need to think about all of those factors, not just one specific aspect. So another topic that should be review, but just want to again refresh your memory. So a calorie, we refer obviously a lot to calories, calorie needs, calorie reduction, all of those kinds of things. So just a reminder that technically what we're usually referring to is kilocalorie, which is actually 1,000 calories. But I will use the term calorie and kcal interchangeably with the assumption that that's actually kilocalorie is what we're referring to, and that's typically what you'll see used as calories. So just kind of a reminder there. Technically what calorie is it's a measure of energy. So it's actually the amount of energy needed to raise 1 gram of water, 1 degree Celsius. So really when we think in the nutrition context, a calorie is the same as energy. So sometimes we'll talk about energy needs, we're talking about calorie needs, or energy expenditure, we're talking about calorie expenditure. So those terms in the nutrition world really are, somewhat equivalent. We use them somewhat interchangeably. So again, just kind of a refresher there. So then again, as a reminder, the calories in food. So there's 3 macronutrients, carbohydrate, protein, and fat, that contribute calories to our diet. Carbohydrate has 4 calories per gram, protein also has 4 calories per gram, and fat has 9 calories per gram. Alcohol, although it's not considered a nutrient because it doesn't have an essential function in our body, it does provide calories, and it has 7 calories per gram. So when we look at these different calories per gram, essentially what it tells us is fat, for example, we can get more calories in a smaller weight of food, which is sometimes why it's easy to overeat on fat calories, because there's a lot there without a lot of volume typically. But these are numbers that you'll want to remember. There's sort of some of those just very basic nutrition numbers that come up in a lot of ways, so they're important to remember. When we talk about energy expenditure, we're talking about how many calories we need in a day. So there's three basic components of energy expenditure. One is basal metabolic rate, or BMR, which is essentially what we need just to function. So that's things like keeping our heart beating, our brain functioning, just to be alive. And that's really about 60 to 70% of our calorie needs during the day. So that's the majority of where our calories go, or just basic functioning um, of our bodies. And then physical activity is about 20 to 35%. Physical activity is what we have the most control over in terms of our caloric expenditure. So obviously we can choose to move more or choose to move less, much more than we can impact our basal metabolic rate. We have very little control over basal metabolic rate. There are some things that we can do to improve that a little bit, but physical activity is really where we have the most control, but it's a smaller proportion of the calories that we need in a day in most situations, unless someone is just extremely physically active. And then the final component is the thermic effect of food, which is anywhere from 5 to 10% of daily calories. So this is essentially what it takes to digest and metabolize food. This is an area that sometimes gets attention in terms of weight management, kind of talking about, okay, well, if it takes us more energy to process protein, then we want to eat more protein, that sort of thing, which to some extent, well, it is true. Some foods take more calories to process them, but this, in the big picture, this is such a small percentage of our daily needs that it doesn't necessarily typically make a huge impact in the overall result in terms of weight management. So just something to kind of be mindful of, because that does, get out, I don't know, floats out there quite a bit in terms of that. So yes, different types of food take more calories to use them, but that the actual quantity is pretty small difference in the big picture of how many calories we need in a day. So as I mentioned, there are some factors that affect basal metabolic rate. So kind of we often hear people say, oh, you have a high metabolism or a fast metabolism, or oh, I have a slow metabolism, or whatever. And there is variability there, certainly. So age affects basal metabolic rate. As we age, our basal metabolic rate typically slows down. Body size and muscle mass both have a factor. With a larger body size and or higher muscle mass, both will increase basal metabolic rate, because with muscle mass, muscle is more metabolically active than fat. Fat isn't not metabolically active at all, but muscle mass is more active in terms of the calories it uses. So to some extent, we can affect basal metabolic rate by increasing muscle mass. Whether we're in the fed or fasting state, so when we've eaten or not eaten, and how long we've gone without eating, can affect metabolic rate. So if we've just eaten, our metabolic rate is going to speed up somewhat. And if we've gone a long stretch without eating, our body tends to slow down to conserve energy. If we're chronically under eating, eating less calories than our body needs, our metabolic rate is going to slow down, because the body's trying to conserve energy or calories because it knows it's not really getting enough. Stress can impact metabolic rate. And actually, I have on the other side illness and fever. So it can actually be physical or psychological stress that can affect metabolic rate. So fever, illness tends to increase metabolic rate, increase the amount of calories we need to function. Growth, clearly, when we're growing, so looking, for example, in children, those types of things, if they're going through a growth spurt, they need more just to function because it's supporting that growth. Again, I just mentioned illness, fever. Some medications can affect metabolic rate, either increase or decrease depending on the type of medication. Sex or gender affects metabolic rate, with males typically having a higher metabolic rate than females. And then temperature or environment, with colder temperatures increasing our metabolic rate, because we need more calories just to maintain our normal body temperature if we're in a colder environment. But again, how much that plays into the big picture is kind of variable, and a lot of these factors we don't have a lot of control over, but some of them we do. So again, muscle mass, we can work to increase our muscle mass. Our fed or fasting state, we can make an effort to not go too long of periods without eating. some of those types of things, you know, can we have some control over to some extent. So when we talk about estimating energy needs, we just talked about that our basal metabolic rate is what uses the most calories in a day. One thing I want to emphasize with estimating energy needs is it is an estimate. There's calculations and formulas, but none of them are perfect. There's quite a bit of individual variability in terms of how many calories an individual person uses. And so these really are estimates, but they do give at least a starting place to think about how many calories a person needs in a day. So there are a variety of formulas out there. Mifflin-St. Jeor is one formula that is commonly used, particularly in the overweight or obese population, and seems to be closest to accurate in that population, although again, it's an estimate, so don't feel like this is going to be perfect, but that's the formula that I'm going to use for this class, just because it's kind of the closest. For the formulas are listed here, and as a reminder for height, that's measuring in centimeters and weight is in kilograms. So you'll want to be familiar with how to convert height in inches, feet and inches to centimeters, and from weight from pounds to kilograms. I want you to know that conversion because typically in the United States, we see height in feet and inches and weight in pounds, but formulas use centimeters and kilograms. So be familiar with how to do that. So essentially that formula, using that formula is going to again give that basal metabolic rate. And then we multiply that by a physical activity factor to get the total estimated energy requirements for the day. The activity factors are also estimates, and then there's a variety of estimates out there. Your textbook has some physical activity factors that we'll go ahead and use. I'm not going to ask you to memorize those because they aren't carved in stone, but that's what you could use for a sample equation. But that's something that I would give you if I was going to ask on a test or in an assignment or something like that. So I just wanted to take a minute to walk through a sample problem here, just to kind of, many of you have done this before and it's not super difficult, but just as a refresher. So if we took a male who's 5 feet 10 inches, 240 pounds, and 55 years old, we would want to first start out by converting his height and weight from the inches and pounds into centimeters and kilograms. So for his weight, 240 pounds, if we divide that by 2.2, we're going to get 109 kilograms for his weight. And I'm going to do some not very nice writing on the board because my writing tool is not very, oops, sorry about that. Let's try again. Right, so we're going to have 109 kilograms for his weight, which we would multiply 10 times that 109 kilograms. And again, I'm just using that formula on the slide. That's right there, without the best handwriting in the world here. And then we're going to do plus 6.25 times his height. So his height, if we take his height in inches, which 5 feet 10 inches would be 70 centimeters, we can multiply that by 2.54 to get approximately 178 centimeters. So we'd multiply that, and then we're going to subtract 5 times his age of 55 years old, and then add 5 to that. And so that number that we get from that equation is going to give us his basal metabolic rate. So that basal metabolic rate with this calculation would be approximately 1,933 calories with some rounding there, and that's fine. It's an estimate, so rounding a little bit is no big deal. So that's his basal. Then what you want to not forget to do is don't forget to then multiply by an activity factor. So I just used the physical activity factor for lightly active, and again, I used the estimates in your book, and that gave us 1.375 as an activity factor for someone who's lightly active. So if I multiply our basal metabolic rate by the activity factor, I get approximately 2,658 calories for the day. So what that would tell you is that's his estimated energy needs to maintain his weight. Now, in this class, we're obviously talking about weight management, and so we probably aren't going to want to recommend his, sorry, I just cleared that out before I was ready to, but anyway, we aren't probably going to recommend 2,658 calories because we're going to want some weight reduction. So we'll talk about that as well, sort of what we'd want to do in terms of weight reduction. But that's how you would use this calculation. So just make sure that you're familiar with that. So then to kind of shift, as I just mentioned, into what, what do we, how many calories do we want to reduce? The basic estimate for calories in a pound is about 3,500 calories equals 1 pound. That is an estimate, it's approximate, and I have some information in your learning unit that kind of talks about that a little bit, but it's a good number to remember just for at least a basic starting point. So about 3,500 calories, and again, I'm just going to write this on the board here, 3,500 calories for a pound. And the reason that it's kind of a handy number to work with is then we can think about, oops, not that, 1 pound, 1 lb. We can think about how many calories we need to reduce to lose a pound. So for example, if we were modifying a patient's or individual's diet only, not adjusting physical activity, maybe they're just not ready to start physical activity, whatever. So they're staying the same physical activity. If we wanted to lose about 2 pounds in a week, say for example, we would need to reduce by about 7,000 calories in a week. So that 3,500 calories for 1 pound, so times 2, 7,000 calories for 2 pounds. So what that would tell us is we would need a caloric reduction of about 1,000 calories per day over 7 days in the week to get that approximate 2 pounds a week of weight reduction. Again, it's a ballpark, and it's not uncommon that people will not lose exactly at that rate, but at least it gives you close. So for the estimate we just did, we said to maintain this individual's weight, he would need about 2,658 calories in a day. So if we wanted him to be losing 2 pounds in a week, if we would need to take off about 1,000 calories per day of that, and recommend that he eat somewhere in the 1,658, and I'd really, round that to more like, 1,700 calorie range in order to lose that 2 pounds a week. So that's kind of how we would use these calculations and estimates to promote that weight loss. Some of your readings today that I'd like you to look at and highlight talk about recommended rates of weight loss, weight loss that leads to health benefits, those types of things. So a common recommendation is anywhere from a pound to 2 pounds per week of weight loss. Anywhere from 3 to 5% of total body weight can sometimes have some health benefits. So again, your readings talk about that, and I'd like you to be familiar with those guidelines from what's in your readings. So with that, we'll shift gears a little bit to talking about hunger and satiety. So really, I see the issue of hunger and satiety as a really key factor in weight management. So again, some of these factors you may have covered already in prerequisite coursework, but to lose weight, we need caloric reduction. We need somehow to consume fewer calories than we're expending during the day. And I think one of the key aspects of that is to help people figure out how to do that with still feeling comfortably full, feeling satisfied, not feeling hungry all the time, because if they are, that's not healthy and that's not going to maintain. So I think understanding some of that complexity of how our body regulates hunger and satiety. So hunger is a physiological feeling. Appetite is a little bit more psychological. So hunger is when our body really physically needs food. Appetite is more when we have a taste for food or a desire for food. And then satiety is that feeling of fullness. So if we kind of start in this this image up in this left corner here with those physiological influences. So to feel hungry, we have it when our stomach is empty, gastric, so stomach contractions. There's not nutrients in the small intestines. We have some GI hormones that, again, your book covers this a little bit, but for example, ghrelin that's released in the stomach produces that feeling of hunger. We also have some um, I guess, physiological aspects, so these endorphins, but that are kind of triggered by environmental things. So we might see food, we might smell food, those kinds of things that kind of increase our desire for food. So these physiological symptoms trigger hunger, and that stimulates us to eat typically. So we'll start eating, start a meal. Again, some of these external influences, more sensory influences. So I think we've all had the experience where we're really not physically hungry. We know we've eaten recently, but we walk past a bakery or we go past a coffee shop or something that triggers us to say, wow, that smells really good. Or you see something that looks really good and we suddenly feel like we want to eat. So both of those are very real factors in terms of what triggers our eating behaviors. And I think it's important to remember that, because when we think about weight management and helping someone to control weight or lose weight, we have to think about all those factors. We can't just ignore the fact that when we see something that looks good to eat, our body's normal response is to want to eat it. We have to take all that into account. So with that, then we kind of start eating. We keep eating based on a variety of influences, and some of those are cognitive influences. So typically, when people are in social situations, that's a common place to eat. More from an external cue, because we're around people, we're having an enjoyable social situation, that sort of thing. We may be eating special foods, favorite foods. The time of day may impact our feeling of a need to eat. So it's like, oh, it's noon, it's about lunchtime, it feels like I should go eat, those kinds of things. The abundance of food and the types of food, actually. So the more variety of food there is, typically the more people will eat. So if we only have a couple of food choices, 2 or 3 food choices, you kind of get your fill of them quickly. Whereas, for example, if you're eating from a buffet and there's a lot of different flavors, our body doesn't get tired, our taste buds don't get tired of the taste as quickly, and so we tend to eat more when there's a really large variety of foods. So all of those factors can cause us to continue eating, as down here you see our stomach is kind of starting to fill up. Then at some point we get that satiation that sort of ends our meal. So things that trigger that satiation or satiety are somewhat physiological and somewhat psychological. So physiological, there are hormones that can trigger that. So for example, leptin is one common hormone that we hear about that's actually stored in fat cells and is released when our body has had enough to eat. That kind of tells us to quit eating. It signals the brain to say, we're done, we're full, stop eating. So there are those types of things. We have stretch receptors in our stomach that cause us to feel full. So this is where some of the factors with satiety come in terms of we need adequate volume in our stomach, or it helps to have adequate volume in our stomach to stimulate those stretch receptors that tell us that we're full. Another thing that happens is once we're eating those foods and those foods and nutrients move into our small intestine, that triggers other hormones to send the message that we're full. And there's different hormones depending on the type of nutrient that's being eaten or broken down, but that hormonal influence from having food in our small intestine can also cause us to feel full and stop eating. And then here it talks about several hours later, those post-absorptive influences. So basically after the nutrients are broken down into the bloodstream, what happens then? So basically then it kind of tells our brain that our body has enough calories, it has enough nutrients to do what it needs to do. We feel full, and then once that starts to be used up, then we start to get hungry again, and the cycle starts again. So there's both physical, psychological, social factors that all affect hunger and satiety. It's pretty complex. There's actually far more complexity that you can learn about. We won't go into that much detail in this class on that in terms of the physiology of appetite regulation, but at least thinking of some of these core aspects. And again, for this class, I kind of think about it from how can we develop or design weight management programs or plans for individual people that help them regulate these hunger and satiety cues within a calorie level that's going to help them achieve the weight that they're looking for. Okay, so a few things that can help with promoting satiety. One is the type of food we eat. So protein and fiber tend to be the most satiating nutrients. So including protein and fiber with meals can help someone feel more full. We talked about those stretch receptors in the stomach. So I think it's important to look for things, ways to have some bulk without excess calories. Fiber is one fantastic way to do that because it does foods that are high in fiber, that are naturally high in fiber, tend to be bulky without a ton of calories. And again, that's not always true, but typically foods that are naturally that way, naturally high in fiber, do have the bulk without a lot of calories. The frequency of eating can help with satiety because we kind of want to eat frequently enough that we don't get so hungry that our body really kicks in very strong hunger cues, because that tends to then trigger overeating. So eating frequently enough to allow us to kind of have moderate hunger cues, I think, is helpful for a lot of people. I put psychological fulfillment. I don't know, I couldn't think of a different word, but essentially I think it's important that people have that psychological feeling that they've had a meal. So for example, we could eat enough calories that comprise a meal in, say, snack foods, for example, like trail mix might be an example. You can get a whole, a whole lot of calories from a bag of trail mix, but you might not feel like you've had a meal. So then you kind of still feel like you need to eat. So I think it's important when people are thinking about weight management that they think about sitting down to eat, really making it feel like a meal, so they psychologically can tell themselves, I've had a meal and I can move on from that and I'm full. And then adequate calories to meet physiological needs. So no matter what, if we are simply not eating enough calories for our body to function, our body is going to try to stimulate hunger because that's its natural response. It's how we were designed for, to preserve ourselves. So people can sort of learn to ignore those signs of hunger, but we don't want to necessarily, I mean, we typically don't want to recommend a calorie level that isn't going to meet someone's physiological needs, because that's not going to help them feel well in the long term. So just kind of a few things there in promoting satiety. I also wanted to comment a little bit about fuel usage in fed and fasting states. So thinking about when we've just eaten, and then if we've gone longer periods of time without eating. So I like this graphic. I think it just breaks it down a little bit. It's from a textbook that actually may have been what you used in your prerequisite coursework. But basically when a person overeats, so if they eat, and here overeating or feasting, this calls it anything that you're eating more calories than your body needs, whether those come from carbohydrate, protein, fat, any of those, they'll break it down into the nutrient depending on what, right in here, depending on what it came from, it'll break it down into glucose, fatty acids, and or amino acids, and then used for different things to an extent. So for example, glucose can go and store as glycogen, but we don't have a lot of capacity to store glycogen. So anything that's left over then goes to body fat stores. And really what I think is important to take away from this is you'll notice every nutrient has an arrow to body fat stores. So basically whether the overeating or excessive calories comes from carbohydrate, comes from fat, or comes from protein, if it's more than our body can utilize for those initial functions, it's then going to be stored as body fat. So there's no calorie providing nutrient that's immune from being able to be stored as fat. So then in this part B, if a person is fasting, and this is fasting really, this talks about 2 to 3 hours after a meal, maybe 4 hours a meal. It takes typically about 4 hours or so to really process what a person's eaten if it's kind of a mixed meal on average. So beyond that, then we kind of think of it somewhat as fasting, short-term fasting, meaning that you have to draw from something that's in the body. So we're going to have some glycogen stores that can give us glucose, and then our body fat stores are what give us the fatty acids. So that's in kind of that short term, like between meals, overnight, those kinds of things. We're using our glycogen stores and our fat stores to give us what we need depending on the cell type that's being fueled. So it talks about that a little bit over here. And then if the fasting continues, like say over a 24-hour period or longer, then we also start breaking down some of our protein, because the protein gives us amino acids, which can provide glucose, which fat can't, doesn't provide the glucose because of how fat is, what fat is, where protein, those amino acids, some of those can yield some glucose, not all of them, but some can yield glucose. So after a longer period of time, we're going to start breaking down protein, which is why we typically don't want to go too long without eating, particularly when we think about weight management. That's breaking down body proteins is sort of counterproductive, because that means we're breaking down muscle mass, which is not what we want to do if we're looking at losing weight for health reasons. We want to maintain our muscle mass. That increases metabolic rate, and typically the muscle is what we want. It's the excess fat stores that we want to get rid of. So kind of bottom line here, carbohydrate, protein, fat, all of them, any of them, if they're overeaten, can cause fat storage and weight gain. And if we go too long a periods without eating, if we fast or eat far too few calories for an extended period of time, will break down both body protein and body fat, which is not necessarily what we want to do. So sort of some key concepts that we've talked about. There are a variety of factors that contribute to obesity or lead to obesity. Typically, it's not just one thing that's going to cause someone to be overweight or obese. So on the same note, when we look at intervention, we need to tackle all of those aspects. Energy needs or energy expenditure for a day are comprised of the basal metabolic rate, which is the bulk of calories someone needs in a day. Physical activity, which is less percentage, but we have some control over that. And then the thermic effect of food, which is a relatively small portion of the calories we need in a day. That key concept in weight management, really calories in versus calories out, does matter. There are certainly things that we can do related to that, kind of the type of food we eat or that kind of thing, but we do need to be mindful of the calories. Even if we're not having someone specifically count calories, the calories do matter. And again, there's very complex mechanisms that regulate hunger, appetite, and satiety. I gave a very basic overview of some really, just some very basic, simple things. There's certainly a lot more information there if that's, if that's an area you'd like to dive into. But at least for this class, being familiar with some of those basic things and the different aspects like hormonal, GI, social, psychological, those types of things that regulate are what causes us to start eating and stop eating. And then any macronutrient, carbohydrate, protein, or fat can cause weight gain if eaten in excess. And in excess is just anything more than our body needs for functioning.